This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Last week, we marked 1 year since January 6th, 2021. I'm not going to say anything about it except this. There's a lot of confusion and back and forth out there over what actually happened on January 6th. We talked to Hugo Lowell from The Guardian, who is literally one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about what actually happened. He's trusted by people inside Trump world and outside Trump world. It was a fascinating conversation. And in this era, when truth itself has never been more important or more under attack, we hope you find it as useful as we did. As a reminder, 100% of our episodes are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask our guests a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. If you want more information about how to join us, maybe want to ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please check out our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
How are you doing, man?
I'm good. Happy New Year.
Yeah, it is a happy New Year. It's kind of weird, though, because we're approaching January 6th right after the New Year, which is obviously a traumatic event for this country. I'm wondering, you must be just inundated with reporting on the committee, especially with the anniversary and Biden's speech coming up.
Yeah, it's been very busy. In truth, I'm trying to stay away from a lot of the anniversary coverage and the reliving of what happened on January 6th, just because it's a little bit extraneous to what the committee is doing. There's obviously some overlap, and the experiences of members and Capitol Police and the violence that unfolded on January 6th is obviously really important. But I'm increasingly more focused now on the connections between the White House and the Capitol attack and what political operatives are doing, and if there was kind of a connection between all three elements that came together to be part of an insurrection. And I'm so focused on that now that I think a lot of the anniversary stuff, while important, is not really on my radar.
And my friend, that's why we have you on, because you've been breaking, as I told the audience, a ton of stories about subpoenas and document requests, and you're going to bring it to us just straight news here. So we really, really appreciate that. Before we get started, you are, as everybody can tell from your accent, maybe not from the U.S. I'm wondering, what kind of impact did January 6th have on the world at large and how they view American democracy, or maybe just the UK?
Well, it comes as a bit of a surprise. I'm actually originally from New York. I actually went to school in New York, and then for high school and college, my parents moved, and so I ended up in the UK. So I think I have a pretty good kind of global perspective nonetheless. And it is interesting because it looms so large in the collective consciousness in this country. And it didn't for a long time in the rest of the world. I mean, immediately after January 6th happened, for sure. And then I think there was a long period when people kind of forgot about it. And then when the subpoenas and the investigation really started to ramp up in the last few months, it's taken on a new significance to the rest of the world as well. It's always interesting to me that in places like the UK, where Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is more of a populist guy, more akin to Trump, there is an element of sympathy with Trump sometimes, and it does kind of astound me, given that I wasn't sure anyone could have sympathy in effectively an attack on democracy. But it is interesting to see how people digest the investigation.
On that note, Hugo, today we got to start with the breaking news. You mentioned administration, I think the past administration. But today, Attorney General Merrick Garland gave a major address about the anniversary of January 6th and his project and the project of the DOJ of holding those responsible to justice. He has been criticized for a lack of aggressive action in the past by a lot of Democrats, pundits, columnists. What were your thoughts on the speech? And do you think that his speech and his tone represents a change in the DOJ, or maybe he was just being misinterpreted by some in the press?
It's a good question. I think the bottom line from this speech was that Garland, and I tweeted about this, effectively, left open the possibility of a criminal investigation into either Trump or the Trump White House or political operatives connected to the Capitol attack, right? He said this thing that he was going to hold perpetrators accountable at any level. And I always thought that was interesting because he could have just said, we're going to hold the people who attacked the Capitol accountable or, people who orchestrated the violence. But for him to suggest that he was going to look at perpetrators at any level suggested to me that the DOJ is prepared to look at the political elements. And that obviously amounts to the White House. It's interesting to think about where the DOJ has been to date, because the FBI and the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia have really spent the last year going after, as kind of people refer to them, like the foot soldiers, right? The people that broke into the Capitol, and they're being charged with kind of a range of obstruction charges. Things like obstruction of an official proceeding, obstruction of a congressional proceeding, and more seriously, kind of conspiracy to obstruct a congressional proceeding. And they have become more and more serious in recent weeks. And so I wonder if it was kind of all building up to this speech today, when kind of Garland hints that the Justice Department is prepared to investigate potentially the White House as well.
Yeah, I always wonder whether that was planned or whether this is some type of different approach due to media pressure. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where this goes and what your reporting tells us. But I do want to move into the bulk of your work, which is the fallout from January 6th, especially the committee and the lawsuits and the requests for data. Just after January 6th, I think leaders across the political spectrum came out and condemned the attack. You had McConnell, you had McCarthy. Just across the political spectrum, there were wide condemnation. And some were blaming the White House, actually. In the time since, however, the event has started to be viewed a little bit differently and more through the lens of partisanship, which we touched on a little bit earlier. And only 2 Republicans are serving on this committee that was intended to be fully bipartisan. With this in mind, what are the realistic goals of this committee's work?
Yeah, it's a good point, right? The trouble with this committee is that there's always going to be a little under half of the country that is never going to accept whatever the committee finds. And I think that's kind of the primary issue with having a select committee that isn't viewed everywhere as bipartisan. I think there is a caveat here in that even if it was truly, bipartisan in the sense that you had, a full roster of Republicans appointed by McCarthy, if they came to the conclusion that Trump was responsible for the Capitol attack, then all the Trump supporters across the world would still not believe anything that the committee said. So I don't think, while I think it's significant, I don't think it matters that much. In terms of what the committee can do, though, they can come away with this with a very good understanding, I think, of what happened in the days leading up to January 6th as well as on January 6th itself, because they have made a lot of progress in the last few weeks. They have, a whole bunch of documents and testimony from White House officials and Trump administration officials, and most significant of all, Trump's former White House chief of staff, Mark Meadows. So I think they can achieve a lot, even if half the country doesn't believe what they find, because they weren't going to believe it anyway. And really, it's up to the rest of the country to decide if they like and accept what the committee has to say. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all the committee can do. They can issue a report, they can issue criminal referrals potentially, and that's really the scope of what the committee is able to accomplish.
Yeah, so I want to touch on what the committee has actually found, and not just all of the different pieces of information. Try and get a common thread here. You mentioned they've interviewed more than 250 people, subpoenaed thousands of documents. I'm wondering if you could put into perspective what the committee has discovered so far, and if there is some type of common thread here. We hear about PowerPoints, we hear about text messages, but is the release of what the committee found leading to some type of narrative of what actually happened? And if so, what should we as Americans and as interested people around the world really hone in on to understand where this may go?
Yeah, that's a multi-part question, Angela. I think the best way to think about where this committee is going is, are they going to be able to put together a narrative thread without kind of significant gaps of kind of what happened in the days leading up to January 6th. What they've uncovered to date effectively is, and I can't say too much because I've got a story coming Friday about some of this, and it's not quite ready yet. But they basically know now that there was an incredible pressure campaign orchestrated by the Trump White House and potentially Trump himself, to ensure that Biden wouldn't be certified on January 6th. All of our reporting, separate to the committee investigation, as well as kind of what we are reporting the committee has found, all points to this thing, that Trump wanted to make sure that Biden wasn't certified on January 6th. Now, whether that was so that they could delay the certification so that Trump could go back to the state legislatures and get them to send alternate states of electors, or whether it was Trump just trying to survive to fight another day so that Giuliani could launch more lawsuits or whatever. The point was they just didn't want Biden pronounced president on January 6th, and all of the efforts stem or come together to that result. The committee's got so many investigations running now; it's sometimes difficult to keep track. They have one team looking at what Trump was doing and saying privately days leading up to January 6th, as well as on January 6th itself. It's got a team looking at the money flow from organizers of the rally to the extremist groups. So, there's just so much that the committee has that kind of speak to the all-out pressure campaign that the Trump White House was trying to coordinate. And it involved Pence, and it involved members of Congress, and it was like a web that crisscrossed the federal government. So I don't know how much of that ultimately ends up in the report. Right? It's difficult sometimes when witnesses say things and you can't corroborate them, you can't put that in a report. But by all accounts so far, they do have evidence that the Trump White House coordinated a lot of what happened on January 6th.
And I know you don't have access to all of these documents, and the committee is obviously taking their time to bring these documents to light. But I'm wondering, you mentioned a pressure campaign. From your reporting, do we know if people in the White House, like Mark Meadows, the Kushners, the White House counsel, even press people like Alyssa Farah, were they involved in the pressure campaign directly, or do we just not know enough yet?
I don't know about specific people, like the press shop, for instance. But we do know that Meadows was certainly, the White House chief of staff was at the nexus of a lot of these pressure campaigns. Right? There was the way a member on the select committee described it to me recently was like, there's a pressure campaign organized by the White House on members of Congress. There was a pressure campaign organized by the White House on Pence. There was a pressure campaign separately orchestrated by political operatives on state legislatures, and the same political operatives were also pressuring the Justice Department. So I think they're different pressure campaigns, if that makes sense. There was a big overarching strategy to ensure that Biden wasn't certified president on January 6th. But certainly what Meadows' communications that he turned over to the committee show is that the White House was intimately involved, and it was people at the very, very top. There's a lot of reporting and a lot of clamor now about, what Fox News hosts knew, what Sean Hannity knew, and how he was directing and sending messages to White House aides and to Trump, and how, Don Jr. was messaging Meadows to get him to get Trump to call off the rioters. That doesn't really interest me so much, because we all knew that Trump had external advisors and at Fox and wherever who were always texting him to do things. The thing that, I've kind of got to the point now where I think the only thing that is interesting is if the committee has evidence to suggest that Trump engaged in some sort of conspiracy that connects the political side of the scheme to stop the certification with the violence. And short of that, I think we don't really learn anything new. We always knew that Trump wanted to subvert the results of the election. The Senate report has already shown that. So I think what is significant is if this committee can do and uncover what Mueller never quite wanted to say, and was able to uncover ultimately, is whether Trump himself was involved in some sort of conspiracy, right? It's fine if you send out criminal referrals to his aides. Like, if they indict Bannon and Bannon goes to jail, great. but it doesn't really advance our knowledge of the extent to which the Capitol attacks stem from the very, very top of the White House.
So you just mentioned all of these different threads, the state election threads, the political operatives at the Willard Hotel, potentially actual work done in the White House. So how should the committee, or how should we look at these different threads? Are these truly independent, or from your reporting, is the committee trying to pull all these different threads and then find a common link? Or by looking at these different threads, is there enough there to begin to actually prosecute certain people for wrongdoing?
Yeah, so I think the way the committee is looking at it is they're trying to build up a case like a prosecutor might, right? And it's important to note, they're not a law enforcement agency. They're not really doing a criminal investigation. They are trying to establish a narrative of events and in order to make legislative changes. And once they've established that narrative, if they can then find evidence of criminality, then the committee wants to send that to the Justice Department for prosecution. Now, in terms of building up this narrative, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll follow up after.
Okay. I mean, in trying to construct this narrative, they're looking at all of these threads separately, but they're seeing if there are connections, right? So, for instance, if I'm trying to think of a good example. If Meadows' text messages showed that, and they don't, but let's say that they had evidence that Trump personally reached out to, I don't know, a member of Congress and told them to object to the results and that their efforts would be supplanted by an attack on the Capitol, then they'd be able to connect the fact that Trump had a political scheme in place, but Trump was also aware that there was a violent scheme in place in order to actually storm the Capitol and halt the certification. And so they're trying to find commonalities between these threads and then use that to construct a case to say, well, we know for sure that Trump wanted to stop the certification. Okay, now that we know that, was that done with corrupt intent? If it was done with corrupt intent, then we can maybe make the case that that is a crime, and he sought to corruptly obstruct an official proceeding or a congressional proceeding. And then if they know that, or if they find evidence to suggest that this was also connected to the violence, then they might be able to make a conspiracy case. So I think this is how they're looking at it. They're looking at everything in kind of discrete senses, but seeing if they can pull it all together at the end.
So one thing that, to an outside observer, may pull it all together is that the committee's investigating a call Trump made to the Willard hours before the attack. Can you tell us more about what we know about this call and whether or not that could be potentially what the committee and what you are focused on kind of uncovering?
Well, so we reported at the end of November that Trump had made several calls to the Willard Hotel hours before the Capitol attack. He made a call to Bannon, in which he kind of communicated that Pence didn't seem willing to play ball with his plan of just either throwing the election to the House or just refusing to certify states unilaterally. But then he also made this separate call, potentially more than one, to the lawyers based at the Willard Hotel. And I think this distinction is important because Giuliani, who was the lead lawyer along with John Eastman at the Willard that night, they were trying to preserve attorney-client privilege. And they didn't want non-lawyers on the lawyers' call in order to kind of shield them from potential investigations down the road, which I think is interesting. They were thinking that far ahead that they might be liable or culpable for something. And so they were very, very careful to ensure that attorney-client privilege was preserved. And on one of these calls, according to kind of our sources who got a readout of it, was that Trump basically pressed them to find ways to stop Biden certification from taking place at all. And the entire basis of this was, could we delay it past January 6th so that we put it into a legal gray zone where on January 7th we still don't have a president certified, and maybe this will give us time to go back to the state legislatures and they can send new slates of electors for Trump. And this was the kind of discussion that was happening. But at the core of it was that Trump didn't want the certification to take place. He wanted to obstruct the certification from taking place at all. And this is now the subject, as we say, of the Select Committee's investigation. And the trouble for the select committee, I guess, is they are going to struggle to get someone to testify about the contents of that call, because Bannon's not testifying, even if he knew and he wasn't part of the call. But the rest of the members on the call, the actual lawyers, may well have a valid claim of attorney-client privilege. And so even if they are subpoenaed, they may be precluded from having to testify. Of course, there's a crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege rule, but we'll see where that goes. But it is going to form part of the select committee's investigation. And the way they're going to look at it, at least according to Thompson, is that they're going to go to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court allows them to see the Trump White House records that the former president is trying to block, and they win at the Supreme Court, then they're going to go to the National Archives and request those call detail records and documents surrounding those calls, which will tell them how long a call lasted, or who the targets were when Trump made these calls, from where he made them. Because did he make them from the West Wing, where there might have been aides that overheard the calls, or did he make it from the residence, where it's less likely that someone heard the calls? So I think this is all yet to be uncovered, and the committee still has a ways to go, but it is being investigated by the committee.
So even if that Supreme Court case is found in favor of what the committee wants, it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that somebody would need to cooperate with that committee who was on the call to actually find out what was said on that call. Is that accurate?
Correct, unless there was some sort of transcript, right? I mean, we know, for instance, if you think back to the first impeachment, Trump's call with Ukraine, that was actually done on a call out of the residence, if I remember correctly, and there was a transcript of that call. It's quite possible that there was a transcript of this call, and we weren't exactly sure, and that's why we didn't put it in the story. But we did hear accounts that Trump didn't use a personal cell phone, and that he actually used a wired phone in the Yellow Oval Room at the White House. And if it was a wired phone, there is potential for there to be a transcript if the call went through the White House switchboard. So it's possible that there exists a transcript of the call, in fact. But short of that, yes, there would have to be some sort of aide that overheard it, or he went and talked about it to someone else, and that someone else then testifies at the committee or is subpoenaed to appear before the committee.
Oh, that's interesting. I had not heard that before. So that's thank you for sharing that with us. So there is a common thread, though, with President Trump, it appears. You mentioned the Ukraine call, which did have a transcript. A lot of other calls don't have transcripts, or investigations looking at Trump kind of need somebody to flip. We had a way back, I think in July, had David Fairholt, who's now an investigative reporter for the New York Times, on discussing the Trump Organization indictments. And he basically boiled it down to be able to find out what wrongdoing Trump could have in the tax scheme, the tax fraud that was being committed. You'd need somebody very close to Trump to flip, like Alan Weisselberg. In this investigation, you mentioned how the committee is kind of hamstringed due to not being able to really enforce stuff on their own. But we did have Steve Bannon being criminally indicted for contempt from the committee, referred to the DOJ, and they've moved forward. What are you hearing from your reporting about this? Is this enough of a measure for the committee to be able to coerce future potential witnesses into testifying and maybe even flipping? Or was this just more of crossing their T's, dotting their I's, something they expected to have done, but really won't change the scope and nature of this investigation? How should we look at the Steve Bannon criminal indictment?
I think the Bannon thing is interesting. If Bannon is convicted, but the penalty is just a fine, he's not going to care. And this comes from someone like I've talked to Bannon repeatedly about this and kind of like what his expectations are. But if it's just a fine, he won't care. I mean, he always tells people about how he raised millions during the Russia inquiry and the special counsel investigation. And that allowed him to retain, some of the best lawyers. He retained William Burke, who is this top lawyer in DC at Quinn Emanuel. And so he thinks if it's just a fine, he will raise enough money to pay it off. And that would be the end of it. these criminal referrals, these congressional referrals for contempt of Congress are punitive in nature. They're not coercive. Once he's punished, that's it. He doesn't have to cooperate with the committee. If he gets jail time, I think this is where it gets interesting. I don't think Bannon wants to go to jail, especially not over this, of all things. So I always thought that if there was a jail sentence imposed, he would be prepared to strike some sort of plea deal with the government. And I'm sure the government would not consider any plea deal short of testifying to the committee. The trouble for the committee is that would all be resolved late into the investigation, right? I think Bannon, I can't remember when Bannon's court date is scheduled for. It's like June or something. It's late spring, early summer almost, by which point the committee is going to have to have already started wrapping up its work, depending on when they plan to issue an interim report. They could issue a report before the midterms, or they may just decide they're going to blow through the midterms and go straight to the end of the Congress. It's not exactly clear yet. But that's very late in kind of the investigative cycle. If they can get his testimony, they will. And the thing with Bannon is he has always said he would be prepared to testify to the committee. He just doesn't want to do it behind closed doors. And his reasoning is, if I testify behind closed doors, it will be like the first impeachment when Adam Schiff hears everything in the SCIF, which is the kind of secure deposition room, and then come out and leak to reporters, selectively, things that make him look bad. And so he doesn't want to have to deal with that. So he has always said he would testify so long as it's public. Now, that's never going to happen now. So I think there is a path here for Bannon to potentially testify or cooperate with the committee. But that kind of depends, I think, on what charges or kind of what penalties he's slapped with. The important thing with Bannon, though.
Go ahead.
Sorry, there's just so much. I'm just
this is
trying to do like an
Hugo, this is fantastic.
The thing with Bannon is that his indictment really scared people. If you talk to other witnesses who have been subpoenaed by like Meadows, for instance, was really quite shaken by this. I think that's kind of what he's told his friends privately. Is that, if you look back at that first tranche of subpoenas, it was Meadows, Kash Patel, Dan Scavino, and I think that's it, right? Yeah. Meadows started to engage with the committee because he saw what happened to Bannon and thought, I don't want that to happen to me. And, this is reflected in the cooperation that Meadows had with the committee. He turned over thousands of communications. He basically threw under the bus Don Jr., all these Fox News hosts. This is where the coup PowerPoint came out, right? I mean, he turned over the actual PowerPoint as well as the email referring to it to the committee. I mean, he turned over a lot of stuff. And this was a way to demonstrate that, I'm cooperating, like, don't hold me in contempt. The trouble was then, after he turned all these documents over, he effectively waived executive privilege and all of this. So then he found himself in difficulty because he then didn't want to testify about it because Trump came after him and told him to stop cooperating and revealing all these damning details on top of all the unflattering stuff he'd shared about Trump and COVID in his book. And so I think he was really in a very difficult position, and this was what prompted him to stop cooperating with the committee. And the result of that was that he was held in contempt of Congress anyway. So there was no really upside for him in doing that. But it did scare Meadows, and it did scare other people into cooperating.
That's fascinating because I was a legislative assistant for a Tea Party member in the House, and Meadows always viewed himself as some type of genius playing 4D chess. But once you kind of really dug into what he was doing, he has very obviously come off as somebody who's just very unprepared and making decisions kind of willy-nilly. So that kind of honestly fits Mark Meadows and his tenure in Congress and the White House to a T from my interactions with him and the sources that I have on the Hill. So that's kind of funny. I wanted to add some color there.
Well, I mean, the other thing of that, of course, is I can just slip this in because this is also funny. And I don't have kind of like this sourcing confirmed to kind of write it in a story, but there is an anecdote that flies around the press gallery on the Hill, which is just before Meadows left Congress, he was pretty determined to get a job in the private sector. And he decided to come round to reporters in the press gallery and float the fact or the idea that he was being considered for White House Chief of Staff. As it turned out, he wasn't being considered for White House Chief of Staff at that point. He had just thought that if he floated that to reporters and they all talked about it, then maybe his potential salary at wherever he went next in the private sector would be higher. Anyway, so he went and told all these reporters, and these reporters all put it out in their stories. And then Trump saw one of these stories and thought, actually, I wouldn't mind having Mark Meadows as Chief of Staff. And then he actually got the job. So from what I understand, there was part of this which was all a bit of an accident, and Meadows never really wanted to be White House Chief of Staff, and he just happened to get the job because he was trying to get a higher salary. So, I mean, that would also fit in the pattern quite well. I always thought that was a really funny anecdote.
It's funny because the narrative that he tries to spin in the press couldn't be more different than the reality. He spins himself as this very principled conservative, putting country first. And just by that anecdote, assuming it is true, you can tell that he's not that principled, and that government first or U.S. first maybe isn't his driving beacon, I would say. So it's right. It's just weird. And he's rather, from John Boehner, or my words, rather incompetent, it comes off like. But enough on Mark Meadows. You mentioned some really, really kooky figures, the PowerPoint from Paul Waldron. We know that John Eastman, who's a whack job at the Claremont, I think it's the Claremont Institute, has also created some documents to plan to basically create a coup. I'm wondering, should we really pay attention to those? I know mainstream media does, not talking about The Guardian. I'm talking about your CNNs, your MSNBC. They see the PowerPoint. They see this concrete plan maybe to kind of have a coup. But the question I have for you is this just more window dressing, or do these people actually have a relationship close enough to President Trump that we could directly, potentially find out that there was a link, maybe a phone call, an email between Trump and these people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know is the straight, honest answer, right? With the Eastman memo, that obviously made its way to Trump, and that was a product of the Willard Hotel operatives that was significant enough that it made it to Trump, and it made it to Pence, and it made it to their respective chief of staff, as well as Pence's counsel, Greg Jacob. So that obviously played a very outsized role in everything. And Eastman's memo, where he outlines these scenarios where on January 6th, so long as Pence decides to reject certain slates of electors for Biden, there is a path for Trump to win. I mean, I think at that point, that meeting happened on January 4th. And I always thought that by that point, Trump had realized that all the kooky stuff that people like his former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, was suggesting, people, like Sidney Flynn was suggesting, all really was just nonsense. Like this stuff about like thermometers and the Cubans hacking stuff and, all sorts of weird, crazy stuff. Like Trump knew that was, BS to start with. But I think by January 4, like in his real moment of need, like he knows now, right? He's only got 2 days left to figure out how to stop Biden becoming president. He then shifts to not listening to these people, but listening to people he thinks really has the power to help him. And that is, Pence, and that is John Eastman, and that is Steve Bannon. And, it's interesting that in his moment, in his hour of need, those are the people he calls upon. He doesn't call upon Mike Flynn on January 4th. In fact, Michael Flynn is nowhere to be seen because Trump doesn't consider him to be a serious contender or a serious operative in his effort to stop the certification. So in that respect, John Eastman is very important. Pence is very important. Bannon is really important. I think the thing with Bannon that people forget is, he had been fired from the White House in 2017, but he had been fired not because Trump didn't value his input. He did. It was because Trump didn't like the idea that he was being puppeteered from behind. And he didn't like the idea that, the media was portraying him as just a puppet of Bannon, and Bannon was really pulling the strings behind him. And that was why, Bannon got fired. And that's unlike any other advisor that was fired from the White House. Trump fired a whole bunch of people because he thought they were just incompetent or they were being obstructionist. He never had that opinion of Bannon. In fact, he really, I think, valued Bannon's input and opinion. And I mean, it makes sense because the whole MAGA movement was originally a product of Bannon. Bannon was kind of the father of MAGA and Breitbart, and so Bannon to this day, I think, has the strongest indication and knows really where the MAGA movement is heading, and I think for that reason, Trump still really valued his counsel. And so I think these are the people that really are important in the narrative of January 6th. Now, compare that to the PowerPoint, right? This PowerPoint was really done at the behest of Flynn. Phil Waldron authored most of it, but it was done really at Mike Flynn's insistence. If you talk to people at the Willard in the war room with Bannon, when I first saw the PowerPoint and I messaged them and I was like, hey, do you know anything about this? Their first reaction was, thermometers in China. That's all Mike Flynn. And I think we now have reporting to suggest that was really the case. And it's difficult to believe sometimes and difficult to figure out where things start and things end with this Trump administration, especially in the final days, because it was so chaotic and really anything went. And Meadows was not the filter he needed to be or was supposed to be as chief of staff. So this PowerPoint ended up in Meadows' inbox. And if you talk to his lawyer, he says, well, Meadows' involvement with the PowerPoint ended there. It just showed up in his inbox, which in itself is pretty damning. I mean, the idea that you don't do anything with a PowerPoint that recommends Trump declare a national security emergency in what would, really, I mean, I think when I reported, I actually just described it as a crude PowerPoint because that's exactly what it was. It was an outline of kind of how to co-opt the military and kind of the executive branch powers of the president to take control of the election result. But as it turns out, this wasn't the extent of Meadows' involvement with it. He actually met with, and this is kind of good reporting from my colleagues at the Post, but he actually met with Phil Waldron and presented it to members of Congress. I mean, not Meadows himself, but the PowerPoint was presented to members of Congress, and he discussed it in the White House. So his involvement didn't just end in his inbox, and so to that extent, I think the PowerPoint is also important, right? It doesn't show that, for instance, that Trump was directly tied to the Capitol attack, but I think it shows the atmosphere and the priorities of people in the administration at that late stage. I mean, this was like January. The version of the PowerPoint that we looked at, if I remember correctly, was a January 4, January 5 version that was marked for dissemination. I mean, that close to the joint session, and they're looking at trying to declare a national security emergency. I mean, it's really unprecedented.
It's a coup, at least in that document. And you said something pretty pressy earlier on, but I worked for the RNC on the 2016 election campaign, and the Trump campaign was leaning heavily on our work for opposition research and a whole host of other things. And it was always laughable to the people in the RNC, the Sean Spicers, I'm not going to name everybody, but people that wound up in the administration, that Bannon was kind of this puppet master. Because if anybody knows anything about Donald Trump, it's that the guy can't think through something logically and maintain that line of thought. He jumps from point A to point B to point Z back to point A. And it was just very, very funny for us. And you're 100% right. Steve Bannon has a feel on aspects of the MAGA movement. I think also, though, people like Mick Mulvaney, people like Mark Meadows had a pulse of the movement because it largely sprung up out of that anti-Obama, anti-government spending of the 2010 Tea Party wave. And the Tea Party became and merged in some instances with that Bannon MAGA base. So I always think that's interesting. But now let's get to the best part. Let's go to the audience questions. Our first question of the night will go to Andy, and then we will go to Greg Sattel. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you so much for joining us today, Hugo. Really great to hear from you. I wonder, looking forward into the future, do you think the committee will be able to achieve set goals before the November midterms, which is potentially, of course, a key date in terms of whether or not it will be allowed to continue beyond that or not? Many thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think it's still to be decided. the problem with this committee is that the momentum comes in ebbs and flows. And early on in this investigation, it was around September, Thompson came up, the chairman of the committee, right, Benny Thompson, came up to a number of reporters and told us in a gaggle that he expected the committee's work to be done by the spring. And we all thought, oh, that's fantastic. They're going to have plenty of months before the midterms and they're going to finish it all and it'll be great. And then he went into a all-staff, all-members meeting that lasted around 5 hours on the first floor of the Capitol. And I know it was 5 hours because I was sat outside on the floor for 5 hours. And it was one of the most uncomfortable things I've done in my life. And it was also freezing. But he came out and he looked much, much more serious. And he said, you're still on track to do it by the spring. And he looked kind of quite darkly at us and basically shook his head. And what emerged during that meeting was the members all thought this investigation would be done pretty quickly. And the professional staff involved told them absolutely no way. This is going to carry through the summer and potentially through to the end of this Congress. And it's because all the investigative actions take a long time. They hadn't even issued a first subpoena at this point, and we were already in September. And from what I understand, from one source at least, is that one of the staff members, told them you have to do subpoenas now. They wanted to do subpoenas in several weeks' time, which would have taken them through the middle of October. And the staff member was like, no way. If you wait that long, I'm going to resign. And really spelled out to them how long these things take, especially when it comes to things like document production, metadata production, when they were subpoenaing court detail records. It all takes, because of statutory requirements for congressional subpoenas, it all takes time. I think it's a 30-day statutory period. So let's say, for instance, that in the best case scenario, the committee had issued a subpoena to Verizon and asked them for call detail records for about 50 phone numbers, right? Because the way that this happens is they don't go to a target and say, okay, we don't go to Verizon and say we want Meadows' communications for the last 6 months. They have to provide an actual number, like a 202-881, whatever number, and say we want all the call detailed records from X date to Y date, and that's how they do it. They can then send their request to Verizon. If Verizon decides they don't want to, be particularly cooperative, they can, send some of the material back and be like, oh no, we've got others. We need another 30 days to produce the rest of the records. And then once they do that, they'll be like, maybe we sent it in the wrong file format. So then another 30 days. And so even if you issue subpoenas, there's the potential for this to run for a very long time. And for companies who might not be inclined to cooperate with the investigation, or individuals who might not be inclined to cooperate with the investigation in terms of turning over documents in the required file format, it all takes incredibly long. And I think this was the point when the committee realized that it was going to be a very drawn-out investigation. And so the byproduct of this is they issued subpoenas immediately. I think that week, in fact, or maybe the next week. I can't remember exactly which day that meeting happened, but I broke the news that Meadows would be the subject of a subpoena within days. And that committee that subpoena came, and we're still talking about Meadows in December, and this was 3.5 months ago. So it kind of gives you an indication of really how long this all takes. They're still in the evidence gathering process. If they finish on time, my guess is that they finish the evidence gathering process around the end of spring now, maybe the early summer, around the same time as Bannon's court date, in fact. And then they have to decide, do we want to issue an interim report, which it sounds like they will before the midterms. But I don't think now that they finish the entire report before the midterms. I think they do an interim report, and then they finish the actual findings close to kind of November, December, maybe end of December next year. And they will use the full length of this Congress, right? Because they have until January if there's a Republican majority, for that Republican majority to take control.
So we will go to Greg Sattel and then Peter Chow next. Greg, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and thanks for joining us, Hugo. Just from my perspective, Justin is super young, so I'm a bit older, and I'm of the opinion that January 6th really started way back in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing, because that's when we first became aware of this, extreme right-wing sort of I guess, domestic terrorism, you'd call it. And in the ensuing 25 years, we really didn't do much about it. And in fact, there's been a strain in law enforcement and in the military that has sort of participated in this extreme right-wing movement. And January 6th, it seemed to me to be the first time that law enforcement, both locally and nationally, really began to take those domestic terrorism networks seriously. What in your reporting have you found about that sort of larger project of how we finally get these domestic terrorist networks under control?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I have a direct answer to it, in part because the committee is not looking at kind of resolving that problem, right? There is some crossover because Thompson is also the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, and that committee certainly has been looking at the infiltration of white supremacists and far-right neo-Nazi groups in the military and law enforcement. There was an anecdote I heard recently about how the FBI has stopped putting issuing domestic terrorism watch lists for law enforcement because law enforcement might look at the list and find that a lot of their friends are on it. So it's obviously a pervasive issue and something that played a very large role in January 6th, not least because those are the groups that made the extremist militias and organizations that seem to have led the attack on the Capitol, right? I mean, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the First Amendment Praetorian, all these groups that have now been subpoenaed by the committee to kind of provide information. These really are white supremacist and domestic, terrorist groups in some respects. And so I think it should play a larger role in the committee than it's really doing. And I think the reason why it's not is because the committee has so many other threads to pursue, and there's only so many things they can do right now. I mean, I think in many respects, they're almost close to being overwhelmed by the amount of investigating they're having to do. They've expanded their team massively, but it's still a relatively small committee, and I don't think they have the time to really be investigating everything. And I think this is something that's going to be left for other committees to pick up. But there is certainly a large element of the Capitol attack that is attributed to these kind of domestic terrorist groups. And but to be completely honest, I can't answer the question directly because it's not formed a large part of the investigation today.
Yeah, and it'll take a whole other investigation, like you just said. So thank you for that, Greg Sattel. We will go to Peter Chow.
As you mentioned earlier, the committee is interested in finding culpability and assigning figuring out motives, right? But their true power comes from their legitimate legislative purpose. And I wonder if we could intersect, this January 6th committee with what we're hearing about reforms to the Electoral Count Act. I think even today, Mitch McConnell mentioned he might be moving towards on that, and that as I understand it, I think that the purpose of this investigation would show the potential cracks in the Electoral Count Act that the Trump Trump people, and MAGA world were trying to exploit to their gain. And I'm wondering, as it's been established so far, where are the lines of thinking of, where this committee has found potential weaknesses in our election certification system as it relates to Electoral Count Act, and kind of just more broader, what should people be thinking of when they hear about the reforms that might be passing through Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they are looking at a number of reforms to the ECA. Not least the vice president's role, right? I mean, this was the fundamental aspect of John Eastman's memo, which was neither the Constitution nor the Electoral Count Act specifies the nature of the vice president's role, and whether it's purely ceremonial or if he actually has the power to unilaterally insert himself into the process and reject certain states. If you talk to conservative jurists, conservative legal experts, and kind of by making a distinction between conservative and Republican here, like conservatives and as in a conservative reading of the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, they would say, of course not. There's no way the founders intended for one person, who may himself be on the ballot, which was the case with Pence, to have the ability to decide whether he can return himself or return the incumbent president to office. So I think the primary reform that the committee is trying to figure out, if they can plug, is this thing with the vice president, and if they can codify more specifically that it is purely a ceremonial role, and that any issues have to be resolved elsewhere. But it can't be that vice president just simply deciding on January 6th, I'm not going to count certain slates of electors. And if you talk to members on the committee, they think a lot of this will end up as a debate of, how and when can we have things go to a contingent election. And I think it's a very touchy issue. It's a very difficult issue. But certainly the committee knows that is the loophole that was exploited by John Eastman, and they want to make sure they plug that. The issue they're going to run into is the Electoral Count Act is in many respects not binding, right? I mean, if you kind of cast your mind back to this time last year, January 3rd, I think it was, in 2021, when kind of the new kind of Congress meets and figures out the rules of engagement, as it were, for the joint session, a lot of this goes to the House and Senate unanimously adopting the rules for the joint session and saying, yes, we're going to play by the kind of procedures outlined. It's possible that come the next election, if there is a Republican majority in the House, for instance, that the current Electoral Count Act is not adopted unanimously or at all in the current instance. And it may be that a Republican majority with Trump on the ballot, let's say Trump narrowly lost the election, like genuinely narrowly lost the election, and makes claims again about electoral fraud, that Republicans in Congress may just say, actually, the version of the Electoral Count Act that we want to play by is going to have the vice president, having the power to unilaterally decide which slates of electors to throw out. And this is the problem, is that short of there being a constitutional not mandate, but kind of something in the Constitution that spells out the precise nature of the vice president's role in the joint session, there remains the scope for there to be abuse. And so whatever reforms that this committee recommends, even if adopted, they may not be adopted by a future Congress that has a Trump Republican majority. I think this is the issue the committee is going to run into.
And if I could just follow in, like you hit on the role of vice president, which was like especially part of this movement, but I think you mentioned it earlier as well, the role of state legislatures and how they might get in on the certification process. Not to mention, I think we saw there's evidence where there was action on the part of folks related to Trump calling Georgia state officials, trying to interrupt that certification process. So is Congress at all looking at how that certification process itself within a state might be prescribed? Because as I understand it, the ECA talks about what to do when there's those discrepancies. But given that Trump world was trying to actually attack, and there were, like in Michigan, they were going after the certification machinery. Is there any elements of, besides the role of vice president, of kind of beefing up the certification process?
I think there is, and in kind of in full transparency, I don't know exactly all the measures they're looking at, in part because they won't tell us. There's been a lot of speculation as to what, and good ideas as to what can be resolved. I don't know what the committee is going to recommend exactly, but my understanding is that, they will also look at the state legislative process. They will also look at the DOJ's role in elections, is what at least one member has told me. And I was going to say one other thing, and now I forgot what I was going to say. If it comes back to me, I'll let you know. I was going to say one other thing, but it's kind of escaped my mind.
If it comes back to you, just let us know. And John Thune today said that he'd be interested in looking at the VP's role, but Hugo outlined why it may not be an end-all be-all solution. So we're going to go to two more questions, and then I will ask Hugo for his last thoughts. We're going to go to Moraine. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, and then John Gunnison. Moraine, over to you.
Okay, hi, thanks. It's Mehran. But, if anybody was awake at the time and followed the news, especially with the Republican congressional leadership reaction to the events, we all know what happened. So this is basically politics. And with any political action, there's always a risk. And the risk here is, what if nothing concrete in terms of sanction or legal coming out of this? Is there a chance that Trump gets bolder and comes back with a vengeance in 2024? Is there a risk? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a risk. I think if anything, Trump has learned for the last 4 years that what he has done, and kind of even if Democrats have condemned him and trying to impeach him twice, if he can get away with it, he now kind of views it as a bit of a joke, right? He got away with the Ukraine call. He basically got away with the second impeachment, even though that was also bipartisan in the Senate. So it does embolden him, but it also emboldens his advisors, right? His advisors say that Trump will definitely run in 2024, and they're also floating the idea that Trump runs for speaker and uses that as a platform to then run for president. And so there is a chance that, Trump isn't, indicted. In fact, there's a very good chance, I think, that Trump isn't indicted. The trouble with all of this is, I think people, watch what Trump said on the stage at the Save America rally and at the Stop the Steal events, and they see quite clearly that he incited the insurrection, or he incited the attack on the Capitol. It's one thing to think it; it's another thing to prove it, and the burden of proof on a prosecutor at the Justice Department trying to make this case against a former president is going to be very, very difficult. It's an extremely high bar for them to have to clear. I think there's a very good chance that there's a criminal referral that comes from the committee, but the Justice Department either declines to act on it, or maybe feels that there's not enough evidence to secure a slam dunk conviction. And Trump will see that, and he will believe that he's made of Teflon and that nothing sticks to him. So yeah, there is a very, very good chance that happens, and really, it all depends on what the committee is able to uncover in its investigation and final report.
And I think that question and answer just kind of hit on one of the reasons why this is so important. It's, yes, we need to look at the bad actors and hold them to account, but it's also for the future. What other types of potential coups could be committed to really subvert the will of the people and basically end our democracy? That's what would happen. Our democracy.
I mean, I just want to add one thing, actually, before I forget. Trump does learn from things that have happened in the past, right? And I most recently thought about this because of kind of the way he talked to people, the operatives at the Willard. He never went to the Willard guys and said, I mean, at least as far as I know, he may have in separate conversations, but in the readout of the call that I got, he did not say, we need to get the Oath Keepers to attack the Capitol tomorrow to stop Biden being certified. He just said, look, you guys need to find a way of stopping the certification. So maybe it's possible that the Willard operatives then went and spoke to extremist group members. Who knows? But Trump has learned in the last 4 years that he should not be issuing direct commands to people, for instance, right? The only time he's done this in the past, really, was when he told Don McGahn, who was then White House counsel, to fire Mueller. He now looks back on this and realizes that moment may have ended his presidency, because that would have been, obstruction of justice. And the only reason it wasn't obstruction of justice is because McGahn never carried out his order, right? If McGahn had actually gone and carried out the order and, Mueller had been fired, or, Comey had been fired, then that may have been the end of his presidency. And Trump now, I think, remembers this very acutely. So everything since has been building up on him learning on his prior actions and learning what things may land him in trouble and what things he may get away with. And so I think, again, with January 6th, there may never be evidence to suggest that Trump directly asked people to attack the Capitol. And it was just in his own cryptic way of talking to his aides, and his aides understood what he wanted to happen. And that was what kind of culminated in the Capitol attack.
Maybe with the exception of McGahn and then also the call with Zelensky, throughout his career, and the Trump Foundation tax fraud and all these other investigations have shown that he's really smart like a mob boss in the way that he gives out what people assume or perceive to be completely illegal commands. He's very careful not to put anything in writing, not recorded.
Right.
So I think it's very interesting that you said that. So we're going to go to one last question, then I'll give you final thoughts, Hugo. John Gunnison, over to you.
Thanks. And before I ask my question, I just want to point out that he has lost tons and tons of civil suits. So he's not always been the best at staying on the right side of the law across the board. But anyway, my question is about another element, another aspect that the committee might be interested in. There's been so much talk in your reporting and also tonight about the effort to obstruct the electoral count. And another shenanigan that some of us were watching in that period in between the election and January 6th was that turnover at the Pentagon, the strange replacement of all the top civilian officials with an unusual cast of characters, one of them being Kash Patel, which is one of the names that you mentioned tonight, Hugo, as one of the first recipients of a subpoena from this committee. So I'm curious, do we know what the committee is interested in learning from Mr. Patel? Is the turnover at the Pentagon a subject of their investigation? And if so, what have they learned so far about those questions?
Yeah, I don't know is the honest answer, right? They did subpoena Kash Patel, and I was there for the deposition. This committee is difficult to get answers out of, especially with respect to where they're going next on the investigations, especially when the members don't make news on TV or otherwise. I think they are looking at they're looking at the Pentagon replacements and the staff changes within the light of, did it help Trump, or was there an element of Trump using that in order to pave the way for him not to, to be able to stop the National Guard from deploying to the Capitol to stop the attack. I think the committee is trying to figure out if there was basically some sort of conspiracy. And I think that's where that plays in. It's very difficult to know because Kash Patel really doesn't say anything, and the committee has not said anything about that element of it. And I think it's one of the very, mysterious elements to January 6th is this whole thing about the National Guard and why it took so long for the Pentagon to approve the National Guard deployment, and whether it took a long time because people like Kash Patel were at the Department of Defense and erected roadblocks or deliberately slowed down a response because that's what they thought Trump wanted or because that's what Trump had asked. It all goes back to, was Trump pulling the strings here, and can they connect it all back to Trump? So I think, certainly that's what I've heard they're looking at. Chris Miller has come out since and said, he knew nothing of what was happening. He had nothing to do with the delay in the deployment, and it was all people like Kash Patel and other kind of political appointees at the Pentagon. So I can't give you a straight answer because I'm not committee counsel, but that's, I think, how the committee is examining the role of Kash Patel, at least.
Thank you for that question, John. So, Hugo, we ask all guests their final thoughts, but specifically, you're a young reporter. You're arguably the best reporter on this specific issue that's out there. You're breaking stories left and right. And it arguably, in my mind, terrorists storming the Capitol of the United States to overthrow an election process and the will of the people is the greatest threat to U.S. democracy in modern history. So it's a very important issue. I'm wondering, what do you want How do you view your role in reporting on these issues and maybe the larger picture? And then more specifically, what do you want the audience to take away from your reporting and the work of the committee?
Yeah, look, I think the way I see myself fit into this is there are a number of witnesses and Trump administration officials who won't talk to the committee, but they will talk to me for whatever reason, whether it's because they like the publicity, they like the idea of leaking to a reporter, I don't know, they like my accent, I don't know. But there has been, for instance, with the Trump phone call to the Willard, there have been a number of instances when these officials are prepared to tell me things that they won't tell the committee, and they won't tell law enforcement, they won't tell the DOJ. And if they are going to tell me this, then I feel obligated to report it and kind of put that in the public domain. I told my editors early on, if the committee can't construct a full narrative, then I see my role as being there to kind of catch the things that don't make it in the report, right? For instance, just Jeffrey Clark's role and whether, Trump wanted to install Jeffrey Clark at the Justice Department for, maybe because he wanted DOJ letters from the DOJ to say there's widespread election fraud and use that as a basis to stop the certification, for instance. That's one of the things I'm looking into. And if the committee can't get it, then I would like to get it. Not because I personally feel great about it. I'm competitive like any other reporter, but I think just it's really important for people to know what these Trump operatives and these Trump administration officials were up to. So if the committee can't find something, then I want to be the kind of safety net and that catches that and still makes that finding public. And the second role I see for myself is to kind of report what the committee is doing. I think one of the frustrations with Mueller and the special counsel investigation and the Russia inquiry was because it was all done by DOJ and everything was very, very secret. People didn't really have an understanding of what exactly the investigation was looking at. And there was a lot of hype as to, when Paul Manafort was indicted, they all thought, this is going to be a building block to more financial crime by Trump, and they're going to get Trump, and there was all these discussions. And as it turned out, the Manafort thing really was just that. It was just Manafort came up, and he happened to have some criminal exposure, and so he was indicted for that. And so I want people to keep abreast of what the committee is doing, so that they have an informed view of where the investigation is going, and can form their own conclusions as to what the committee should be looking at or not looking at, or how they think it should progress, rather than have people just generally appear on cable news and start talking about the investigation as if they know what's going on when really they don't. So I think that's the kind of the second role, to kind of keep the narrative guardrails for the committee and kind of tell people what the investigation is looking at. I forgot your third question.
No, sorry about that. Just what you want the public to take from your role in this, which I think you partly outlined.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much kind of my role. I think it's what more the public should get from the investigation. And already we're only 3.5-4 months into the evidence gathering process with the committee, but it's already become abundantly clear that Trump, maybe unsurprisingly, was prepared to use the office of the presidency to effectively undermine democracy. I mean, he knew he had lost, but he couldn't bear to think of the fact that he lost to Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe. I think it really rankled him. And he couldn't believe that he was, effectively a loser, was how one aide put it to me. I was like, he doesn't like losing. He didn't like the fact that he lost to Biden. And so he was trying to find any way to make sure that he could return himself to office. And, it's maybe a warning to us that there are people and there are presidential candidates who are prepared to go to any extreme to make sure they remain in power. And so I think people need to look at this and really understand that, Trump wasn't just playing around and trying to subvert the results of the election because he liked to be in power. He really wanted to undermine democracy here. He wanted to make sure that Biden wasn't certified so that he could cause maximum chaos and then at the end of it emerge as emerge as president for a second term. And yeah, that's really all I can ask for as a reporter, that people read my stories and conclude for themselves, what they think, Trump was up to and the damage that he was prepared to cause.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Hugo and The Guardian for coming out, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please check out our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.